Hey there! Welcome to the 7th episode of many discussing the smaller aspects of gaming history. Today we're going to talk about Codemasters, a company born from teenagers that love programming and release titles such as Dizzy, Grid, and Call McRae. I'm your host, Sick Jake.
And I'm your co-host, Tesseract E.
And welcome to the Ready Go Gaming Show special. Simple graphics on a simple computer. A time where imagination led your experiences through simple bleeps and bloops. And a time where the box art suggests that the tiny dot you're looking at is a magnificent warrior of legend. This is the golden dawn of PC gaming. A time that occurred near the start of the second generation of gaming. A time where simple text commands, courtesy of BASIC, would let you create rudimentary games, in some cases text adventures, and on the other hand, incorporating culturally relevant games such as Dungeons & Dragons. This is where two brothers from South End, England came about entering the video game industry by hopping onto their father's Commodore PET to create exactly that, a text adventure version of Dungeons & Dragons. The names were Richard and David Darling, the creators of what would eventually be known as Codemasters, one of the most popular PC gaming companies in the 1980s. But how did they get there?
Well, after their brief stint programming on the PET, it was time to move on to another computer, the VIC-20. That move allowed the brothers to form a company called Darbert Computers, where they made rudimentary attempts at porting popular arcade games from the time, such as Namco's Galaxian and Williams' Defender. Ironically, these games, even as clones, made bank. This piqued the interest of their father, who helped them manage their business. Oh, did we mention that these brothers were 11 years old? That's right. For the first time in Ready Go Gaming Show history, we're talking about a company created from the ground up by children. By the age of 16, these brothers were making so much money from creating clone games that they started another company known as Galactic Software. But they still needed help with publishing their titles.
The company that would help them accomplish this would be Mastertronic, who were already known for their low-cost games. Games that cost $1 and some change. However, Mastertronic wasn't successful in this regard, and as a publisher, they slowly declined until the Virgin Group picked them up and pooped them out to Sega. While this business venture didn't work out in the long run, they still managed to strike gold in distributing Sega Master System games in the UK. Luckily, the brothers had enough capital to generate another company, one that would stick, and create hundreds of hours of memories for PC gamers in the 80s and 90s, Codemasters. As a company, their first game would be BMX Simulator, and by making budget titles they produced themselves, they saw mild success. Their business practices were interesting. Instead of hiring dedicated developers, they would hire freelancers. Examples of this would include Terra Cognita by Stephen Curtis, Ghost Hunters by Oliver Twins, Laser Force by Gavin Rayburn, and Danger Zone by Mike Clark.
As the 90s rolled around, the console market attracted demand from consumers, and so did the PC market. 8-bit computers were dying to technological obsolescence, and the 16-bit computers and consoles were also quickly fading into irrelevance. Codemasters during this point made the call to hire programmers for platinum conversions, officially moving from the budget game industry to the full-fledged video game industry, which was standard at the time. But they were known for something much more interesting. If you know the history of Nintendo, you know that they approached the video game crash of 1984 very cautiously. If you haven't checked out the second episode of Ready Go Gaming Show Generations, we covered that pretty in depth and alluded to Nintendo's seal of quality. What does this mean? It means that Nintendo would approve a seal of quality for their third-party developers and would handle the potential for market saturation by limiting the amount of games that a company could release per fiscal year. Traditionally, this was set to 5, but companies found a few ways around it.
In some cases, companies with large capital were able to create shadow companies. Konami would release their heavy-hitting titles under their brand, but then would utilize another company they created, Ultra Games, to get an extra 5 titles under their belt. But in some cases, people would break the rules and make pirate or unlicensed games. A prime example of this would be the religious titles from Wisdom Tree. By reverse engineering the NES lockout chip, companies could release their games without the permission of Nintendo. The company of choice from Codemasters would be Camerica, which was notorious for its supremely subpar games. You might also be familiar with the Aladdin Deck Enhancer, which hosted numerous Codemaster titles as well.
But if they could reverse engineer the NES, why couldn't they reverse engineer the NES games themselves to make the experience more interesting? Codemasters did that in 1990, creating a device known as the Power Pack. This device would allow for random variables to be edited, which would have profound impacts on the game being played, from infinite lives to worlds without floors, and honestly, this idea was wacky and fun. But it wasn't released as the Power Pack. It was instead unleashed as the Game Genie. Fundamentally, this pissed off Nintendo, and if you know Nintendo, you know that they don't like people messing around with their technology. This became one of the first big examples of them bringing another company to court over a modification or enhancement to their system or cartridges.
But Codemasters wasn't exactly in the crosshairs. In the UK, the Game Genie was pushed by Camerica, the same company that had created numerous unlicensed games. In the US, it was made by Galoob, a silly name for a toy company, but strong enough in the courtroom to win against Nintendo. Soon after the lawsuit, Codemasters would open offices in California, and in fast-forwarding to the future, would begin to tackle the PS2 era of gaming, where their contemporary influence began. Franchises such as F1, LMA Manager, Overlord, Project Cars, Operation Flashpoint, Call McRae Rally, Dirt, and even the Lord of the Rings Online, Shadows of Agmar, were taking the industry by storm for niche customers. Once 2010 rolled around, the company slowly started fading away. 50% of the company was purchased by Reliance Big Entertainment, and as the years went by, they started slowly increasing their stake in the company. Take-Two Interactive was initially interested in purchasing the company, but Electronic Arts would trump Take-Two's bid, and in 2021, Codemasters was acquired by Electronic Arts.
Now it's time to take a look at some of the franchises that Codemasters was responsible for throughout the years. They made tons of independent games, and for this episode we're only going to talk about the franchises, but we do encourage you to go out there and check out all the games that Codemasters has made throughout the years. Maybe you'll find something you like.
Sports games are massive in America, namely baseball, basketball, soccer, hockey, and football. But in the rest of the world, cricket is a big deal. Cricket is like baseball, but about 20% more confusing and in an oval instead of a diamond. One of the more popular cricket games was Graham Gooch World Class Cricket. Yeah, Graham Gooch is one of the most legendary cricket players in the UK. Gooch! What a name. I guess Graham Taint or Graham Perennium was already taken. Anyway, GGWCC would be released in various locales where cricket was popular, and in each regional variance, the endorsements differed. In Australia, you had Allan Border Cricket. In South Africa, you had Jonty Rhodes II World-Class Cricket, and in the UK, you had Brian Lara Cricket. Codemasters would publish Brian Lara Cricket in 1994 for DOS, kicking off a string of these titles up until 2007. The second game would be Brian Lara Cricket 96, but it was pretty much the same game with barely any changes. It would be 2 more years before another entry was released, this time for the PS1. And to be honest, it doesn't look so bad. Oh, and for our Australian viewers, this series was duly known as Shane Warne Cricket, so if you see that game series, just know that it is indeed the same, just localized differently. There would be 3 more titles, each getting slightly better. But the last major entry in the series we saw was 2007's Brian Lara 2007 Pressure Play, and it was a PSP game. So I think it's fair to say this series is dead in the water.
In the video game development world, getting a celebrity endorsement on a game is a blessing, if you play it right. Look at Madden Football, Tiger Woods PGA, Lee Trevino's Fighting Golf. If it could be endorsed, people sought it. Codemasters did this with cricket, as was evident by the previous franchise, but they followed through more prominently in 1998 with a racing game called Rally. The celebrity endorsement of choice for this one was Colin McRae. I think it's fair to say this was a highly successful series. The first one was simply called Colin McRae Rally, a simple racing game with 3 levels per rally. It handles wonderfully. The graphics are fairly decent for a PS1 game from the late 90s, and it's, well, just fun. The follow-up was Colin McRae Rally 2.0, and it would be the final series entry on the first PlayStation.
This one featured more cars, some of which were from the 70s and 80s, and in terms of mechanics, nothing really changed. But it did look wonderful, and honestly, it was the same for every game that got released. Eventually, it would turn into Dirt, with the first entry being Colin McRae Dirt in 2007. The same year, unfortunately, the Colin McRae would pass away in a helicopter crash with his sons. Codemasters would release one more game with his name, and then would remove his name entirely from the series, keeping only Dirt as the title. Since then, 7 more titles have been released, still maintaining the same energy as before.
When you think of the cultiest of cult classics, then look no further than the Oliver Twins Dizzy series. Starting in the late 80s and going all the way to 2022 with the most recent release at the time of this recording, Wonderful Dizzy. At its core, it's a platform adventure game, where most of the time you're carrying objects around very slowly to your objective. These games are incredibly archaic, but at the time it was pretty decent. The first game was called Dizzy, the Ultimate Cartoon Adventure, where Dizzy, the anthropomorphic egg, searches Kathmandu for multiple objects to make a potion to defeat the wizard Zax. And yes, this is what the game looks like, and no, it isn't incredibly fun. In some cases, I would venture to say this is absolute poop, but to each their own. In general, games on the ZX Spectrum were very hard on the eyes, and the fact that they worked at all is phenomenal on a fundamental level. It's even more amazing that this title was voted the 5th best game of all time for the ZX Spectrum, so keep your standards low with it. As a franchise, it would mostly remain on various computers, but Treasure Island Dizzy was the first game to be ported to consoles such as the NES, the Amiga CD32, and Jaguar? Well, that's definitely a choice.
Treasure Island Dizzy is a radical departure from the original formula. There's a physical inventory system and side quests, and instead of dealing with enemies, the game is more focused on problem solving. Fantasy World Dizzy would be the 3rd game, but you might recognize it as Mystery World Dizzy on the NES. In this title, you have to find your girlfriend Daisy. King Troll kidnapped her, and it's your job to save her. Oh, and also find 30 coins. Pretty easy. Game 4, Magic Land Dizzy, was the first game in the series to not exclusively be made by the Oliver twins, but instead by Big Red Software. You might recognize this game on the NES because it was known as Wonderland Dizzy, and it was very mediocre at best. From that point on, Dizzy was a cash cow for Codemasters, and the games kept pouring out. Dizzy Panic was a puzzle game. Bubble Dizzy was a novelty arcade game. Spellbound Dizzy was kind of Dizzy 5. And as time went on, we would be exposed to 11 more Dizzy games. The most recent title was Fantasy World Dizzy, re-released on a contemporary NES cartridge. If you like jank games that are novelty, check out Dizzy. If you want a quality experience, maybe stick to Mario.
Codemasters liked 4 things: guns, Eggmen, simulations, and cars. The F1 series fits in the mold, and it's one of many, many different racing-related games that Codemasters popped out. For a long time, this series was an EA product, starting with F1 2000 for the PlayStation, but that was designed by Visual Science. It was decent, as were the next 5 games. They were usually in the racing genre, but occasionally dabbled in simulation. In 2009, Codemasters would be entrusted to carry the mantle of publishing the games for the F1 series, which is what we care about here. F1 2009, designed by Sumo Digital, was regarded as a dark and muddy game, which in terms of art can be sort of devastating. And by the time Codemasters got a hold of the F1 series, EA had already run it into the ground. From 2009 to 2020, Codemasters published the hell out of these games, and they've improved a bit, but out of nowhere, EA took back over with F1 2021. Oh well.
Oh hey, racing. Grid is a racing series that Codemaster put out, starting with Race Driver Grid in 2008. As a modern racing title, it isn't bad at all. In the game, you accept jobs and earn money, eventually buying your cars and starting your teams. It's a cool concept. The sequel Grid 2 was released in 2013 and again kept the same energy, actually ending up being more realistic than other racing games at the time. Again, you have some semblance of plot by playing as Patrick Callahan, who is an investor who wants to launch the WSR, the World Series Racing. Beat the driver and get them to join the circus. In some ways, it fell short of expectations, but still a really fun game. Grid Autosport would essentially be the same concept, but this time, according to consumers, Codemasters returned to the formula that made Grid so successful in the first place. It was an amazing simulator. There are 2 more titles, with the most recent being Grid Legends, released in 2022.
There's not much to say about LMA Manager other than it's your standard football simulator. And by football we mean soccer, but we say football because even though we're based in America, we aren't that culturally insensitive. There've been 10 of these games, and they're all pretty much the same. Manage the league, win the game. Done and done. Remember Micro Machines? Toy cars were all the rage in the 80s. Mattel's Hot Wheels and Galoo's Micro Machines pretty much took the cake for being the most successful out of the competition. And what better way to promote your already succeeding toy line than to create a hunk of shitty software to make kids feel more involved with their toys? That's what Codemasters did in 1991 for the NES with the release of Micro Machines, and shockingly, it was massively successful. This game was released and re-released for a plethora of consoles, all the way from the Amiga to the GameCube. It is kind of archaic having this top-down view, but if you enjoyed RC Pro-Am or any racing game from that genre, it wasn't that bad. Micro Machines 2 Turbo Tournament was practically the same game, and through the entire series, that would be the standard. It even had a unique cartridge called the J-Cart that allowed for 4 players to play simultaneously without the need for any additional hardware. All in all, there were 7 games in the series, with the most recent being Micro Machine World Series in 2017, and, spoiler, it sucks.
So far, we've covered sports simulations and vehicle simulations. Now it's time to cover military simulations, which is exactly what Operation Flashpoint is. The first 3 were released by a company called Bohemia Interactive. Those titles would be Operation Flashpoint, Cold War Crisis, Red Hammer, and Resistance. Codemasters entered the fray in 2009 with Operation Flashpoint Dragon Rising, which is a direct sequel to Cold War Crisis. However, due to a falling out between Codemasters and Bohemia Interactive, Codemasters exclusively worked on it. The plot is simple. In 2008, a global economic crisis is in full swing, and China has taken the fictional island of Skira, which is based on Kiska. It's your run-of-the-mill Call of Duty clone, but it is more physics-based than other games, and that's the only thing it has going for it. The problem is that it's a lot of action in a bland world. There are massive amounts of bugs, and the teammate AI leaves much to be desired.
Operation Flashpoint Red River received the same treatment. Codemasters just really couldn't figure out enemy AI, and that would be the downfall of the franchise, as no further games were made. But for those who are familiar with the Arma series, it is a spiritual spin-off of Operation Flashpoint, and honestly about 500% more fun.
Do you like action RPGs? Do you like games that make fun of established genres? Then you'll love Overlord, because that's pretty much all it is. The games themselves weren't developed by Codemasters, but instead by Triumph Studios. For those of you who don't know who Triumph Studios is, they made the 1999 turn-based strategy game Age of Wonders. So in essence, they are a more contemporary company. Anyway, Overlord, released in 2007, is an action RPG with dark humor elements. You control the Overlord, as well as an army of minions, who have the objective of wiping out the 7 heroes that killed the previous Overlord. Each of the heroes has been corrupted by a deadly sin, So by proxy, you have to be the bigger asshole. Think of it as Pikmin with swords, set in a high fantasy environment with a dash of corruption system akin to Fable. It's a really fun game, unless you're playing the 360 version, because of a game-crashing bug about 3/4 of the way through. Yikes. Also, irrelevant of the version you play, the multiplayer is wonky and unstable. I doubt it's even supported nowadays, so I guess it doesn't matter. The game was generally successful though, so much so that an expansion was created a year later. It expands the story, adds new weapons and armor, and much like the base game, was incredibly fun. That is, if you can deal with the BS.
The sequel, Overlord 2, kept the same framework as the previous title. You still get all your little Pikmin-esque goblins, but you play as a new Overlord. Spoiler alert, the Overlord you play as in the first game gets lost in the abyss in the expansion, and yes, the expansion is canon, so yeah. It looked better and played better as well. If it wasn't for the story of the first game being so relevant, I'd venture to say you should just skip that one and check out the second game instead.
Then instead of a third entry, we got a spin-off, this time for the Wii called Overlord Dark Legend. Dark Legend was developed by Climax Studios. You might recall them from making Sadeki or Silent Hill Origins. Again, you keep the various colored minions, each with their abilities. The kicker is you get the stereotypical Wii magic sprinkled on the game, so you know there are gimmicks, such as the nunchuck attachment to grab your minions and toss them at enemies. It's silly, but it's pretty. And even with the Wii motion controls, it's not that bad. What should we do for the next game? Why not jump to the Nintendo DS for a puzzle action game called Overlord Minions? They did that. It wasn't anything special to write home about. Then we had Overlord Fellowship of Evil, the final game in the series, released in 2015 for contemporary systems. This game was a major departure from the normal format, and instead of the perspective we were used to, we jumped to the isometric view. Oh, something of relevance to mention, this game was developed by Codemasters, and it was horrid. If Codemasters wants to keep this franchise alive, they're gonna have to dig deep, because they left the franchise off on a bad note.
Why not another racing game? Project Cars is perhaps the most innovative, expansive, and realistic driving simulation out there. The key competitors at the time of its release were Gran Turismo and Forza, so developers Slightly Mad Studios had their work cut out for them. But we aren't going to get too much into this first game because Codemasters really had nothing to do with it. While Slightly Mad was a subsidiary of Codemasters, Bandai Namco put their stamp of approval on this one. Fun fact, CARS is actually an acronym for Community Assisted Racing Simulator. Why? Because the game was 100% funded by the community and the developers themselves. The publisher only put their name on it and didn't fund the development at all. Project Cars 2 was even larger, had more cars, more tracks, and was epic, but the whole series went to shit with the third entry. In some cases, many critics and consumers said it was almost unrecognizable compared to the previous entry. In any case, the final game was a mobile game, so I think it's fair to say this franchise is dead and gone. Sucks too. They had a good thing going.
Toka is... I'll give you like 1 second to guess. Racing, that's right. Here's a cookie. This is a racing series created by Codemasters, but the important part is that Toka was the predecessor to Grid. Toka Touring Car Championship was released in 1997 and ties directly to the 1997 British Touring Car Championship. So in reality, it's a very niche game that was considered the best in the genre until Gran Turismo rolled around. The sequel, Toka 2 Touring Cars, was practically the same game, but introduced many more tracks, some of which were fictional. Also, vehicle damage was a huge part of Toka 1, and in Toka 2 they ramped it up, which for some weird reason was a major selling point. I could see that being a pretty big deal when it comes to realism, but I'm pretty sure once Burnout rose to prominence, that crown was transferred.
Toka World Touring Cars would be released in 2000 and was more of an arcade game than a racing simulation title. Essentially, outside of the multiplayer mode, it felt like more of a centralized time attack arcade title. But that isn't bad. It's actually really fun if you enjoy racing games. Toka World Touring Cars was the third game in the series, also known as Jarrett and Labonte Stock car racing in the US, mostly because as a Toka game, it didn't include anything relevant to the British Toka series. Again, fun arcade title, but it kind of irritated consumers who had enjoyed the series to date. The fourth game was Toka Race Driver, also known as DTM Race Driver, also known as Pro Race Driver, also known as V8 Supercars Race Driver. This time, it was a plot-driven game where you play as Ryan McCain, trying to make his way in the racing industry because your dad died while racing. True story, that's the actual storyline.
Toka was brought back after being nixed from the previous title, but don't get used to it. It was just to appease consumers after the last fluke of removing it. Keeping the same confusing naming convention as in the previous game, Toka Race Driver 2 offered more in the Department of Championships, crossing over various racing formats. But as we mentioned before, they didn't keep the British Toka in the game, despite having Toka in the title. Speaking of cuts, the character was cut too. Instead, you just play random NPC number 1 in a first-person perspective. And if you want to get spicy, there's a version on the mobile phones, and yes, it sucks.
The most recent title was Toka Race Driver 3, released in 2006. It kept the same premise with 120 championships and 35 different styles of racing. It was a fantastic game, but the idea was kind of run into the ground, and Grid needed a chance to shine.
And there you have it, Codemasters in all of their glory. From the early years of pink and green to providing some highly unique experiences across a few genres, Codemasters truly did it all. While they might not be the cult classic company we once knew and loved, EA still manages to keep the company alive. And who knows, maybe they'll get their chance to shine again one day.